Washington House Republicans have a new budget lead after Drew Stokesbury, the longtime ranking Republican on the House Appropriations Committee, was elected House Republican leader. His replacement on appropriations is a Central Washington Republican who will face the same challenge as Stokesbury, trying to influence tax and fiscal outcomes as a member of the minority party. Joining me now to talk about his new role is State Representative Chris Corry of Yakima. Welcome to the program. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
And congratulations on this new role.
I appreciate that.
Why did you want it? Let's start with that.
So when I was, I came into office in 2019. In 2020, they asked if I would jump on the Appropriations Committee. Didn't know a whole lot about it, but quickly fell in love with it. We handle the operating budget of the state, but more so than that, we get to see a lot of policy issues that potentially affect the budget. So we get a bit of everything. Obviously, it's hugely important to the state how we operate to make sure that we've got money for any number of programs across the state. So when I was asked to serve as an assistant ranking, I jumped at that. And then when Drew took his leadership position, they asked if I would be willing to step up as the appropriations ranking Republican, and obviously couldn't say no.
I've talked to him previously about how he tries to be effective as a member of the minority, especially in the Budget Writing Committee. It was interesting because this year we saw a bipartisan budget come out of the state Senate, not the case in the House. But where do you think you can be effective, and what would the kind of Representative Corry's signature approach be to this job?
So a couple things. One, I think similar vein to Representative Stokesbury, I want to work with the majority to do what's right for Washington State. I was very impressed by what the state Senate did this past budget cycle by having bipartisanship and having Republicans in the room. That's something I'm going to continue to push for because I think it makes for a better budget for all of Washington. Republicans represent a good number of people across the state, and we should be heard as well. I disagree with the approach the House Democrats have taken where we can submit requests. That is, I appreciate that piece of it, but I think that in order for us to have a budget that works for all of Washington, we should be in that room. I am collaborative, right? I want to work with the majority party to make sure we have good fiscal footing, that we make sure that we're not overspending, we're not overtaxing, and we're doing what's right for the state. But I'm not going to be afraid to call them out when we disagree. And I think when we offer real alternative solutions, I want to make sure that those are front and center, not because I want to go after the Democrats, but because I want good solutions for Washingtonians.
And what do those good solutions look like from your perspective? What would be some sort of guiding principles that you will bring to bear, that you have brought to bear as a member of appropriations and now in this ranking position?
So overarching, I would say fiscal responsibility. We have a state budget that's at $70 billion now, and that is the most in our state's history. We're spending a lot of money, and I'm always wary of the future, right? Let's take a look at the budget stabilization account. We are in the bottom percent of states in terms of money saved for a rainy day. I know I have members that have been here when we had the last Great Recession, and they tell me how painful it was for them to go through, what it was like to have to cut budgets across the board, and the whole reason behind the BSA was so they never had to do that again. And yet here we are, 10 plus years later, and we're out over our skis again, I believe, and we're looking at potentially some, bad years ahead, depending on where the economy goes. And I want to make sure that we can have our core services, and to do that, you obviously have to have some fiscal restraint and not overspend, and I think we've done that with the budget stabilization account. We're at less than 10% of reserves, and I think that that's not a good place for us to be in as a state.
Of course, the state's bond ratings are quite good, and the majority party points to that frequently. And they would, argue that they have been budgeting responsibly. How do you respond to sort of what they're saying about, the ending fund balance specifically, and then more broadly, their approach to budgeting? Sure.
I think there's two areas that I would say, yes, right now our bond rating is good, but that can turn rather quickly, especially if the economic numbers turn. We've seen some of that buoyed by, let's say, our capital gains tax, and they say it's been much stronger than they anticipated, but I'm not sure that's going to be there down the road, that number may be consistent or at all, given the recent legal challenges that have been approached for the capital budget, or for the capital gains tax. Yeah. I think that's one. And also, we've got a number of new programs that are becoming entitlements down the road that will stretch our budget even further. And so, again, just looking at an immediate bond rating, I don't think is the best way to hedge our bets in the future.
What does a healthy reserve, what kind of ending fund balance, and I realize the budget stabilization account is separate, it's constitutionally protected. What would you be looking for? What would be a sort of a baseline or a floor from your perspective?
So I think 10% of your budget should be held in reserve. So, there at current spending, we'd look at least $7 billion. We're not there yet. Unfortunately, some of the unemployment numbers we've seen over the last year means that even though it's constitutionally protected at a 2/3, we could be looking at a simple majority to spend that money, similar to what happened with COVID, where we had what I thought was a healthy budget stabilization account that was moved and put in a non-constitutionally protected account. Now, albeit it wasn't all spent, but it could be. And I think Washingtonians are having to budget. They're having to make sure that their finances are tight, and I think the state should do the same thing.
Democrats, there has not been an broad appetite to do across-the-board tax cuts, especially middle-class tax cuts. We've seen bipartisanship around the working families tax credit and trying to potentially even expand that going forward. What are your thoughts about the tax, about the potential for? I mean, again, you're in the minority; you don't get to make the decision here. But what would be as you're having conversations with the majority party, what would you be saying around the question of tax cuts?
So I've always been supportive of funding the working families tax credit. I think we should go further. It's not the tax credit that I would personally roll out. I think I would roll out something more robust and universal rather than a rebate. I would rather have it stay in their pockets rather than it come to Olympia and then sent back to them. But again, working in the frame that we have, I would continue to support expanding that. I think there's another area that we can provide immediate tax relief to Washingtonians around this cap and trade with the Climate Commitment Act and the gas taxes going up so high. Just today, Representative April Connors, the House Republican, unveiled her program, the CAR program, which is the carbon auction rebate, that would actually create a rebate program that we can do in the upcoming short session to get money back to Washingtonians, excess of what we originally projected that would come into the state. It's a real way that we can work in a bipartisan fashion, I hope, to get people money back, because right now we're hearing, and I'm sure you are as well, just the impact of this tax on people's pocketbooks as they go to fill up around the state.
Do you have any indication at this point that Democrats would be interested in that conversation in the 2024 session?
I do think so. I think we've seen Senator Mark Mullet unveil his plan. Ours is different. I think it's a little more aggressive to get more money back to people. We believe that the climate cap and trade tax is very regressive. It's hurting low and middle income people the most. It's hurting our farmers. They were supposed to be exempt, and they haven't been. I think that's one area we're going to have to address. But whatever we can do to provide, the quickest relief in the shortest amount of time, given the constraints we have.
What about property tax cuts or relief? I know that there's been proposals from Republicans to do some sort of homestead exemption in this state, where maybe the first $250,000 in value would be exempted. Democrats often push back on the idea that they want to target tax breaks to those who need it most, and so somebody who's got lots of money and a $5 million house would also get that same exemption, and they don't seem terribly interested in that kind of approach. But what about property taxes, and where might you, if you could make some changes, where would you go with that?
So I think the Homestead Exemption Act is something we should look at. You got to be careful when you do anything like this, because you potentially set up a tax shift. So the broader the base, the better. I think that it should be uniform. I don't think that we should pick and choose winners and losers when it comes to property tax exemptions. And I also think there's areas where, if you're not a traditional homeowner per se, but you're a renter, those potential property tax exemptions could mean, a slower increase in rent on your property. So I think that that's something that we definitely should look at. Again, we have a very robust revenue stream coming into this state. So the idea that we need more money, I think, is shorthanded. I think we need to look at returning more of that, because we can operate our state's core functions of government without, increasing taxes on people or picking and choosing who gets the rebate.
I realize you're on appropriations, not finance. I'm asking you taxation questions, but bear with me. Let me ask you one more, which is just, there was a bipartisan group that was looking at broader tax reform, and that's now been sunset. And nobody's really expecting anything significant to come out of it by way of legislation that we'd see bipartisan support for. But there are a lot of complaints about our current tax structure on both the left and the right. And so I wonder about the sort of political reality and the potential to try to update or upgrade our tax structure for the current century. Do you see any momentum, any movement, or is that just sort of a dead on arrival kind of issue?
Well, what I've seen so far in Olympia in the 5 years I've been here is that we talk a lot about the regressive nature of taxes in this state. But all the new proposals I see don't actually address the regressivity. They just increase the tax base by increasing taxes. So to me, my goal would be if you're going to adjust taxes, you need to do it in a manner that's revenue neutral and that doesn't favor winners and losers. So if you're looking at a progressive income tax, yeah, I definitely think that's dead on arrival. The state has repeatedly rejected that. I do think that we do need tax reform and tax relief. So I think the relief is really important. You also have to remember at the same time we're talking about all these, we've done things like the cap and trade and those things, which is an indirect tax on people and it comes out of their pocketbooks, whether it's one that directly gets written to the state or rerouted through another method.
Do you have a prediction on what happens with the capital gains tax? I mean, it was upheld, but now there is another case moving forward, I guess, in federal court. What at this point, do you think, do you tell your constituents who may not, who may have an opinion one way or another about this, it's here for the foreseeable future, get used to it, or do you?
Well, there was that lawsuit filed by the Freedom Foundation, or a petition, I should say, to the U.S. Supreme Court challenging the state Supreme Court decision.
Right.
So if that gets taken up, I think all bets are off on whether or not it gets upheld or not. My concern is that it creates kind of just a wild west of potential new taxes of states going after each other in other areas, because as we've seen, the state is reaching into transactions that happen outside of our own borders, with the only connection being the domicile of the individual who happens to be making that exchange. So you could, in theory, in one of the rules they have, sell a coin collection in another state, and the state says you're going to owe capital gains on that because you owned it and you're from Washington. I think that's a huge problem, and I think there's a real interest, I would think, from other states to say, let's not let Washington do that, because it may create a whole nother issue across the country.
We'll go back to the spending side of the ledger. The state was sued over education funding more than a decade ago in the McCleary case, and it took many, many years for the legislature to get into compliance with the court, which retained jurisdiction in that case. Now it would seem as though that one of the challenges for budget writers going forward is making sure that you don't slip back. Of course, education funding is the paramount duty constitutionally in this state. Generally, the rule of thumb has been that it should be about 50% or a little better of the state budget. What are your thoughts, and what do you think your responsibility and your sort of caucus's responsibility to be ensuring that the state uphold that commitment?
Sure. I think, while we're upholding that commitment, we also need to be making sure that we're holding our schools accountable. Right now, we're spending an average of $18,000 per student for education. We have some of the highest paid teachers in the country, some of the best benefits in the country, and yet our standards are slipping, and we're losing students to other forms of education, whether it's private school, homeschool, and the like. So we need to ask ourselves, while we're spending this money, what are we getting for that? Our schools are really struggling right now. We have 70% proficiency in, I want to say it was math, in English, and about 50% proficiency in math. Those aren't numbers to be proud of. And so I think our responsibility as House Republicans is to say, what are the deficiencies? If they're COVID related, let's do targeted learning assistance programming so that kids get the tutoring they need. If it's after school supports, whatever those are. If it's alternative schooling, if your school district is not working for you, what are the financial alternatives we can give you so you can go get the education you need, whether it's charter school, private school, homeschool, and the like. I think we want our kids to be successful, and we want them, obviously, because they're our next generation, right? They're going to be our future. So we need to get them the support they need to be successful in our state.
Can you be more specific about kind of what that accountability might look like from your perspective?
Like I said, tutoring, homeschool programming, not homeschool programming, after school programming, and the like. I'm kind of let's figure out what works. I think we need to expand our charter schools. They've seemed to have had, good success in our state. They've had challenges as well. A lot of those are due to policies put on in Olympia to not give them full funding compared to their other publicly funded public schools. Yeah. And so I think that's one area where we could do some more good.
While you're focused on that accountability piece, do you have a position or a view about keeping the state in kind of constitutional compliance vis-a-vis funding? And there has been some slippage in terms of the percentage of the budget that goes to K-12 in the last couple of years.
I mean, we're funding them more now than we ever have before. As a percentage, we're close to 50%. We may not be right at that 50% mark. What I would like to see is what needs aren't being met. What funding needs are you saying aren't there to give you the support you need? And let's have that honest dialogue with funding as well as accountability.
I know you've pointed out the $70 billion budget and expressed some concern that the budget is growing too fast. On the other hand, there's been bipartisan support for increasing funding for things like behavioral health in the state. There's certainly a bipartisan acknowledgement of the housing crisis. So I mentioned education, the paramount duty of the state. Can you give us a couple of other, what would be your number 2, number 3 priorities for spending? Where do you think, especially in, of course, a 2-year budget has just been written, this will be a supplemental year as you head into 2024.
Sure.
But where do you think the state should be prioritizing its spending?
Well, I think what we should be looking to is not necessarily where the state has to spend money, but where can the state get out of the way, right? You mentioned our housing crisis. The state can't spend its way into, building a bunch of new housing. I think there's a role that they can potentially play in some affordable housing, but what we need to do is look at, are we making housing more expensive to build? And right now the answer is yes. We're seeing proposals coming out of the Building Code Council that will add $45,000 per new home built to comply with energy mandates. That prices out people. We know that for every $1,000 you add to a cost of a home, you're pricing somebody out. So what are we doing to get out of the way? Whether it's permitting, right? We keep adding dock recording fees. We added a new one this year. Makes it more expensive to permit and build a home. Those are the things I think that we can't just dump money into it to solve the problem, because we know when we're building housing as a state, it costs more than having the private sector build the housing. So I would say let's get out of the way to help them build housing. When it comes to homelessness, yes, we have had bipartisan agreement on putting money where it needs to go. And I mentioned that at the beginning, right? What are our state's priorities? And if our state's priorities are getting people off the streets, getting them the help and treatment they need, then we're all for spending that money as part of our core functions of government. But we also need to realize that, a lot of the policies we've had over the last few years have really increased some of those issues out on the streets. And so in order for us to rein them in, it's going to take more than just money to get them there.
There are some new payroll taxes that have been instituted in recent years by majority Democrats, working paid family and medical leave, and then also more recently this long-term care program. The argument that the proponents make is that these are benefits that are needed by people who are not getting them through their workplace. Insurance, for instance. They make the argument that most people are going to need some sort of long-term care in their lives, and that this is a way to sort of offer a Social Security type of benefit for those. But there's been a lot of opposition from Republicans about these programs. How come, and how do you? These programs are now in place, and unless you get the majority, you won't be repealing them. But sort of, how do you hope to kind of inform the ongoing conversation about these programs? Because, for instance, with the long-term care one, there's going to be questions about just long-term sustainability.
Yeah, we have real concerns about the solvency of the long-term care program. Actually, the studies that they did show that you will have to have an increase in the fees in order to keep it solvent. There's a couple things, right? Fundamentally, I don't think it's the role of the state government to provide long-term care insurance. We have an ability to incentivize insurance markets by not jumping in. We actually really hurt the long-term care insurance market in Washington State by this program. And we saw as people rushed to get their own programs, it actually shut the system down. Financially, I think that if you're gonna run this program, and again, fundamentally, I think that we shouldn't be involved in that. But if you're gonna do it, you actually have to run it like an insurance program. One of the things that I found interesting was some of the advertising that we've put around the program, saying you're gonna get more benefits than you pay in. I actually sent that over took out the Washington stuff and sent that over to the insurance commissioner's office and said, if an insurance company were to offer and market a program like this, would you allow them to? And they said, absolutely not. We would not let them sell a program like this. And then I said, well, Washington Cares is marketing it like this. And I was told, well, they've set it up so it's not an insurance program, so we don't actually have regulatory control over it. So we just need to be honest with, if we're running an insurance program, we need to treat it as such. If you're a 20-year-old, why would you need long-term care insurance? There is, as it's traditionally defined, you don't have the asset base to run that. So if we're going to be stepping into roles like that, we have to be real clear about what we are and what we are not. And if we're not going to be an insurance company and run it like an insurance company, the question is, should we be doing it at all?
One of the things that, and this goes back a little bit to McCleary, that we have seen is a lot of budgeting kind of by or in response to litigation.
Sure.
And so the latest example would be that the counties have now sued the state over state funding or lack thereof for indigent defense, for public defenders. I'm sure you talk to county officials. Obviously, all legislators come from localities. Yeah. I don't know if you've had a chance to, if you heard about the lawsuit or had a chance to review it, but like, what do you think about the county suing the state and saying, look, you need to, as state legislators, pay more to help shore up this system?
Well, the county I live in was one of the ones that are part of that lawsuit, and I've heard from both prosecuting attorneys in the county as well as judges that say we need more help. And I'm, broadly supportive of that, right? We have rules in place, and we have a lot of unfunded mandates that go back to the counties and other local municipalities. And if we're going to tell them to do something, we should be there to help them fund it. So I haven't studied the lawsuit too much. I have a feeling it will impact us in our budget decisions going forward. I would love to move away from this reactionary piece, whether it's, True Blood or other McCleary, other decisions, to where we're actually listening to what we're doing and figuring out a way to move forward without it being under the purview of a court.
Couple last questions. One is just a big picture question about the current political climate that we find ourselves in this state and then in this country, and sort of it goes back to kind of my first question about how do you work with the other side of the aisle, and how do you sort of approach being in the minority. But I'm also interested in the fact that you're from Central Washington and that there's a urban-rural divide in this state. And it certainly feels like, even though we haven't maybe been as polarized in this state as some other places, that we're seeing progressives get more progressive and conservatives get more conservative. And I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts or reflections on where we go from here and kind of how to manage through this time. It's a polarized period of time we're in.
Yeah, it's very polarized. I think what surprised me when I first came to Olympia is the importance of relationship building, because when you're sitting on the outside and you see mostly what happens in DC, where it seems like the only thing that gets covered is when people are just bashing on each other, right? Every press conference seems to be just calling the other side names, and and I think that makes you largely unsuccessful here in Olympia. Now, there's times where it happens, right? But what I have found is the more successful I am, it's by relationship building. I try to seek to understand what the other side wants, and hopefully from the other side, communicate from my end why we're trying to get what we want. I think I've had a lot of success building those relationships. I'm from Central Washington. Yeah. I have legislators from the Puget Sound coming through my district all the time. I've had them over to my house. I've had people who I disagree with on any number of issues, spend time with my family, whether it's at my house, in restaurants, in the community, just to see how we live and to see why when I approach situations and say, I'm not telling you not to do this for your community, I'm asking that you understand why it may not work for my community. Whether it's public safety, housing, things that may make sense on paper for a Puget Sound legislator may make the opposite of sense for me in Yakima. And whether it's transit, whatever those issues are. So I seek understanding. I try to build those relationships. I'm going to do that as the ranking Republican in appropriations. I think you can get more done when you're not always adversarial. That doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a place to be adversarial when needed. Yeah. But for me, it's important to have those relationships so I can express my side and hopefully work on some compromise to get things done.
A final thought as you step into this role with House Appropriations, again, being in the minority, heading into a supplemental year, a time when the economy is still little, we're not really sure what the future holds, right? And we're still coming out of, the effects of COVID are still reverberating, to be sure, across the economy and when it comes to our school children and so forth. So just a last thought on kind of charting the future here.
Well, I think there's a lot that we don't know, and what I would tell you today, probably a month or certainly in January, maybe a completely different story. What I will commit to is that I want to make sure that we are appropriately budgeting, that we're fiscally responsible with the state's money because it's not, or with the people's money because it's not ours, and that whatever we do in that 60-day window, obviously will, hopefully tide us over. Again, whether it's, providing some tax relief, I think we have a huge opportunity with the carbon auction rebate to really give money back to people to help them move forward and during this challenging time.
Okay. State Representative Chris Corry, the new ranking member in the House Appropriations Committee. Thanks so much. Appreciate you coming in. And thank you for tuning in to Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.